Hello and welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today we are in the corner where I kick off a sewing project and I'm super excited about this one. And so is Spooky. Just kidding, she ran away, so she's not excited. I take it back. Let's just jump right into it. I'm gonna start by showing you guys the pattern here. This is New York, I think 109. I picked this up on Etsy about 6 months ago. I've been thinking about it, so before I film this, I am next week, is it already a week away, going to Cape Cod, and I kind of wanted to make something summery and fun. I love this dress, which is just this cute little dress with buttons. But this is a dress that I think is fairly genius because you can actually shorten and lengthen the skirt with buttons. And then there's little button loops and stuff. Like, I feel like it's just a really fun example of the way the 40s and then the 50s used these decorative pieces to actually make a thing really multi-purpose. And like when I'm thinking of going to Cape Cod and like wading in the water, you can take a longer skirt and all of a sudden hike up to this shorter skirt. And I think that's really fun. So I want to give it a try in time for my trip. So the description on this is a waist with gathered front neckline, finished with binding, set in short puff sleeves, attached to two-piece gathered skirt. 4-piece separate shorts with an opening on left side, attached waistband. I'm probably gonna skip the shorts. I am not convinced shorts like these are gonna go anywhere near fitting my booty and my thighs, and I'm gonna have to do too much work to get them to fit. So I'm gonna skip the shorts and stay with the dress. This is the fabric that I'm using. It's this beautiful slate gray denim I picked up in Rome a few years ago. I have been fairly reluctant to use it for anything, but it is actually a pretty light denim. And the reason I haven't used it for anything, hopefully you can still kind of see it here, is it's actually a really lightweight denim, and I haven't been sure about how to use a denim this lightweight because it's not good for coats, it's not good for pants, it's probably best for skirts or dresses. So that's what we're gonna do here, and my thought is with the buttons is to do a ton of different colors with then matching thread loops to those colors of buttons because I have so many single buttons I've collected over the year. I thought this would be the way to go. The biggest thing I don't know is how many buttons I actually need. You can't tell by the drawing, but also it seems like there's some buttons around the collar too. So all around I have questions. Oh no, this envelope's falling apart. I will stop shaking it like a where is that even coming from? Anyway, we're gonna stop shaking this envelope around and just jump into cutting it out. This is actually the day before I'm gonna start on this project. I thought I would film this, take a nice long evening nap, aka sleeping, and then wake up and start by cutting this out tomorrow morning. I just felt like I needed to sleep on my idea, and then we are gonna jump into actually cutting Haylee in the morning. Alrighty, let's kick this off. I am cutting out my fabric. This is really straightforward. This is one of the most straightforward cutting out processes I've done in a long time. The only adjustments here that I made is, of course, I added a back seam to have a back zip, and then I also added the 5/8 an inch to the side seams to give me an extra 3 inches of wiggle room for fits. Technically, when I measured this, it seemed like it was going to pass the fit test, but I got a little nervous because it's denim and it's a little bit thicker, so I wanted to make sure to leave myself plenty of room on the sides, and I want this to ultimately be a pretty comfy dress. That's one of the things I love about denim dresses is they just feel really like casual and fun and like comfy. So I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of ease in this so it would actually be comfortable for me. And then the last adjustment I made is when I cut out the sleeve band, which is essentially bias tape. I did it with extra few inches to accommodate my arms. But other than that, this was a really straightforward cutting out thing, so just enjoy. As always, this is here where I'm going to plug my Patreon. So you can head over to Patreon to support me if you have the desire. I do some exclusive polls to decide projects. It does go in phases. I feel like I put out like 3 polls in a couple weeks and then it's like dead for a couple months. So you've been warned. I also sent out a cute little postcard of me and Spooky that I commissioned from a local illustrator, and you get early access to videos. As always, please only support me if you are in a good financial position to do so. I want my subscribers happy and healthy above all things, and if you have the extra money to support me, I appreciate it, but I don't want anyone struggling to do that. But with that, let's go ahead and continue along this video. As usual, the instructions have me focused on the front. I will say the instructions for this project are incredibly challenging to read, partially because they are falling apart, so I did take a photo and put them into my computer and process them and reprinted some instructions so I wouldn't be dealing with the fragile instructions, but also they're just kind of that not step-by-step instruction illustration thing that is usually a lot easier to read. So I'm going off of my own experience for a lot of these things, but it does seem like I should first focus on the bodice, specifically the front part of the bodice. So here I am adding those darts. We just have 2 in the front because the gathers in the neckline make up for any side darts you would normally have. There's also like this facing/gathering guide. I would describe it more as a gathering guide than anything because the instructions actually tell you if you want, you can cut it out and not leave it in the final thing. I wanted to leave it in the final thing, so I am prepping the edges to top stitch so that way they can be clean and beautiful. After that, I am doing a gathering stitch, which I did my usual way, except for I did my math wrong, so things are closer together than I prefer, so I actually had to put in 3 rows of stitches. I shifted things with my foot incorrectly, so as a result I had to put in 3 whole rows because it wasn't right. I wish I took better footage, but here I am staring and rereading these instructions a gajillion times because I'm still unsure about what they're telling me to do. So I keep reading and keep looking, and these are the ones that of course I've printed out after getting some good photographs and figuring out how to not have to touch the falling apart instructions. Alright, so what the instructions say is with wrong sides together to gather the neckline to the guidance neckline piece. This is super strange. This is not how things are normally constructed. And also eventually you just like wildly cut a gap in the middle, which you'll see it made me so anxious to do. But to prep myself for that gap in the middle and the fact that I'm apparently just going wild and cutting it, I am leaving myself a little bit of ungathered space there so that way it will work naturally and hopefully look good. And this is definitely a pattern that you would not be able to make if you don't have a lot of experience because they were having you make a lot of wild assumptions in this project. Okay, this is the part of the project that made me so anxious. I am cutting down the line that it says to cut down, and it says to just, I'm gonna say raw dog it, but that feels like a really inappropriate way. But honestly, that's how I was feeling like I was doing, is I felt like there was no protection, nothing good was happening here, and I was just cutting a slash down the middle of my pattern piece, and it was a feeling. What they actually have you do here is you are bias binding with a very thin seam allowance. So I have my bias tape. This just made me anxious. I don't know. This gave me a lot of feels. I'm glad I'm as experienced as I am before I tackled this pattern because it could have been terrible. I think in the future, the way I would do this is I would do this with a traditional facing method. I don't think this bias binding situation worked particularly well, but because of what I was doing for the rest of this piece, I was like, I'm gonna do it the way the pattern tells me to, and if I don't like it, I'll alter it next time I do this. And here I am ironing the bias binding and prepping it to be good to go for the hand sewing part. But yeah, no, this whole process felt very weird, but it turned out okay. I trusted the process. It turned out fine. However, I would never do it this way again. This was incredibly high risk way to do a slash like this. They be wild in the 40s sometimes, especially in New York patterns. You can't trust them. During this time, I've also prepped the back piece, which involved just putting in a couple darts, sewing up the back seam that I added so I could have a zipper back there. I am going ahead and using pinking as my seam finish in this project, so I pinked this and then I will press it open. And now I will be pinning the sides and shoulders together. Everything is sort of turning out okay, but yes, almost everything about this project made me kind of nervous. The one thing I will note, because I had to ease a little bit in between, like usually in 50s patterns, they actually have you gather this, but in the 40s, they assume I think you're better at hand easing. So I did have to like kind of ease the denim together. And what I will say, this denim eased really, really nicely into each other when I sewed. I thought that was really handy and definitely made me feel a little bit happier about certain types of denim. Also, Spooky just joined me on my lap, so you will probably hear the little baby cat purrs. Alright, my next step is to bind the neckline. I am just doing each half since it has that big slash down the middle. I feel like I keep saying that over and over again, but every time I think about it, it just feels a little bit more wild. I'm doing this as a straightforward bias binding, right sides together, and then sewing it. Not pictured, I did yank out all the gathering stitches I had previously put in, and now I am doing the like kind of double fold over myself by hand. This will be hand stitched down. I'm not going to use my machine here, but I'm just kind of manipulating things, trying to be pretty patient with it because denim is not maybe the best bias binding out there. However, I did feel really like sturdy, and once you got it in the correct position, it worked really well. So far I was pretty pleased by this material. It's a lot sturdier than what I'm used to working with. With the bodice mostly done, I am now moving on to the sleeves. Starting by putting in my gathering stitches, I am gathering along both the sleeve head and then the was gonna say the cuff, but this is like a short sleeve, so it's not a cuff, but the bottom of the sleeve. Both of them need gathering stitches because these are gonna be cute little puff sleeves. With the gathers in, I closed the sleeve using the little armpit seam, and this is quite a short seam, so it's going to be quite a cute short little sleeve. Here I'm gathering the sleeve into the little armband cuff thing that I cut. So what I'm doing here is I have put a pin in the middle of both the cuff and the middle of the sleeve, so that way I can make sure I'm gathered evenly and the sleeve won't twist. I think this is where I went wrong on my last puff sleeve project where I had some twisting problems. I think I didn't know where the actual like middle was, so I wanted to make sure to mark those and then gather up accordingly. And from there I am just stitching it down. These ask for 1/2 inch seam allowances because it is a 1940s New York pattern. 5/8 doesn't really seem to become the norm until the 50s. This is just an observation from sewing a ton of patterns from a ton of decades. It's not a fact, so don't come for me if I'm wrong. Just nicely tell me in the comments. And I am then yanking out the gathering stitches since everything's all stitched in. I just like to do this because I don't like having random thread floating around my project. Even if it's going to be completely covered, I just think it's kind of worthwhile to get out any thread or any stitching that doesn't need to be there. And to reduce bulk in the sleeve, I am going to cut this down to about 1/4 inch and then double fold my bias binding because yeah, I don't feel like I want this area to feel particularly bulky because then it will feel uncomfortable and probably kind of restrictive on my arms, which is one of the worst feelings in the world for me. Before I joined the sleeves to the bodice, I decided to get some hand stitching done just for a little break from the machine. So I am sewing down the bias binding I made around the neckline, the slash, and the sleeves. The sleeves were the easiest and most relaxing part because they were completely separate from all the fabric. I also just like to do this to avoid getting stuck with pins while I am gathering and sewing things, but also because it's easier to manipulate fabric when there's less fabric to manipulate when I hand sew. And now I will be matching all my markings and all my notches and things like that with each other, and I will be easing the sleeve in. There is quite a bit of puff on this as expected, so I did kind of have to work on maneuvering the gathering for this. I do want to note when I'm gathering this way, I will often put knots in the thread to then be able to gather further, like closer to where the thread ends or like the sewing part ends, because otherwise it's hard to like kind of go from a denser gather to a more and more loose gather, which is ideal for something like a sleeve head. And now I'm sewing. Spooky apparently doesn't trust me to set a sleeve. She is right on top of my sewing machine. I would say watching carefully, but let's be honest, she's watching the birds outside. For some reason, she just feels the need to watch the birds outside from the top of my sewing machine. In retrospect, I wouldn't have used this binding type, but I did use a rayon binding because I just didn't really want any bulk in here, but it was a bit too thin to cover the edges of like this thicker denim, and I should have used a more traditional like cotton binding bias. And the last thing I'm doing, bear with me on the poor lighting, is I have sewn one tube to test for making bows. There are supposed to be basically bias binding tube bows on the neckline, on the waist, and on each sleeve. So I am just testing out my technique here before I will then take a break and go to bed. I am back the next day and it is time to focus on the skirt. So unlike most times in my processes, I'm not actually going to close up the back. So instead I'm first starting by placing my pockets. I will then sew these at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And after I press them open, I will then put them pocket to pocket, right sides together with their corresponding skirt seam. And then I will sew a 5/8 seam allowance all the way down the side of the skirt around the pocket, and then finally up the little bit that I have towards the top. It's important to do this 3/8 and 5/8 seam allowance thing because this is a different fabric pocket, so it will be visible. So giving myself that extra 1/4 inch of a seam to hide the pocket in is a kind of important step for this. And since this is a gathered skirt, losing that 1/4 inch is not a huge deal. And because because denim in its nature is already a little bit bulky, I feel like going with a zigzag seam finishing on the pocket will be fine because the denim will be thick enough to hide it. I don't recommend this for thin fabrics. Sometimes with thin fabrics, I've noticed you can still see the profile of the pocket because this does make the pocket edge a little bit like wobbly. So I only really recommend using this seam finishing for a pocket with a heavier fabric. And then I will press this open with the pocket pointing towards the front because I have put pockets in backwards before, and trust me, it does not feel intuitive to have a pocket go towards your butt instead of towards your front. Again, I would say I have very close supervision, but let's be honest, Spooky is just sleeping here while I put in my gathering stitches. Here, I again messed up my counting or whatever, so I had to put in 3 rows of stitching. I don't know what's going on with me, but my well-oiled machine is a little less practiced today. And I want to note here, I still have the back seam completely open on both the bodice and the skirt. The reason I decided to do that is because of the thickness of the denim. I thought it would be easier to gather this in kind of more of a straight line setting. So I've again marked my fourths. I put a pin in the front of both the bodice and the skirt to match. And then there's the 2 seams on each side, which will divide this neatly into 4 so I can hopefully get a really even gather. For a dress like this, I just always think a even gather is important. I guess not even just for a dress like this, just in general. And once that is done and sewn, I am again going to yank out these gathering stitches. Very satisfying part of the project for me, and will keep things neater later. The other thing leaving the back open allows me to do when I do it as the last step, this is me finally closing the back with markers in place for a zipper, is it lets me really look at the garment and evaluate how low I think I need the zipper to go for it to be an accessible garment for me. So I have evaluated that, I have my zipper chosen out, I have everything marked, and now I will finally sew up the back of this dress, leaving basting stitches where the zipper goes in so I can press that open and then install the zipper. And I again want to emphasize that I am using a pinking seam finish here. Sometimes around the zipper, I like to consider other finishes like a zigzag finish, but because this is such a tightly woven denim, I'm not worried about it unraveling and getting caught in the zip, so I feel pretty good about my pinking decision. And we have another spooky sighting while I install this zip. I can't believe she didn't get annoyed at me because I definitely poked her and threw the dress on her on accident a few times, but she's a very, very, very accommodating cat, and I appreciate that. With the zipper installed, I can now try it on, assess the hem length I need to put on. So with that assessed, I am now doing the seam finishing of the hem. Because this is like a square skirt essentially, like there's not much curvature to it, I am not going to put any basting stitches, just top stitching will do the trick for this. And I actually want this dress to hit pretty long on me because one of the reasons I like a dress like this is potentially sun coverage. And my legs are very pale, very sunburn oriented. So as a result, I'm not putting much of a deep hem on this guy, even though this will leave the length quite a bit longer than I prefer most of my garments to fit. Also, because of the button technique, I can make this shorter at will, so I don't know why I wouldn't take advantage and give myself an extra long hem. And now I'm back to hand sewing forever. I don't know, I feel very like I've chosen hand sew heavy projects on this channel recently, and this project is no exception, although the hand sewing intensity is not exemplified here because I'm just doing a normal hem, and because this is a 1940s piece, the skirt is not nearly as full, so there's a lot less to hem. With my test bow being a success, I made 3 other bows, and then now I'm just trying to tie them to get them to look their best. Sometimes this involves untying and retying them a gajillion times. I'm trying to get the ears to look even and everything to like sit and droop correctly. I don't know, it's kind of ridiculous, but because I like to then sew these down, it's important to me that the bows look perfect. And now it's time for me to sew on these bows. I am putting the ugliest ones on the sleeves because they'll be seen more often in profile and they aren't like near my face or waist, so I feel like the ugliest ones sitting there are correct. And yes, there are always, when you make 4 bows, there are always the top tier quality bows and there are always the bows. Now it's time to talk buttons. I'm excited. So this dress requires 10 buttons on the top and bottom. Technically, according to the pattern, it's 12, but one of those buttons is so close to the seam that I assume that the 2 different button marks are supposed to denote 1 button. So I'm going off that and we're gonna go 10 buttons. So I decided on kind of like a rainbow order and then also a size order. So the top tier is gonna comprise of smaller buttons and then the bottom tier will have bigger buttons, just because that's how my brain wanted to put it together. I don't don't know. I kind of have like a variety of buttons, and then I'm doing them in rainbow order to make sure I have a distribution of buttons. I put way too much thought into how these buttons were going to be distributed, but I wanted it to feel random yet cohesive. I don't know. Sometimes my brain's just funny like this. I can't help it. Once I have played with my assortment of buttons enough to get to the color range and variety I desired, I then locked in my decision by taking a photo with my camera, put the buttons I was going to use in a tray, and got to work. So having all of these different colors of buttons meant I had to have a lot of different colors of button thread, or I guess just normal thread, out. I'm going to use embroidery thread to stitch these on because I want to use embroidery thread for the little like button hook parts, and I want the thread of the button to match the thread that will hook on it exactly. So I took a piece of 6-strand floss, I took one piece out, that's what I'll sew the button on with, and then I'll make the little button loops with the 5 strands. But yeah, we're just hand sewing away. Honestly, this was kind of fun because I got to switch thread colors all the time, and looking at these buttons was fun. I'm not a huge fan of sewing on buttons, but because of all the different colors, this was a little bit fun. And then for the button loop, like I said, I'm going to have the thread match the button it attaches to. And what I'm doing here is, I think they usually use this technique to make the little belt loops that keep the belt at the proper height on your dress. So that is the technique I'm doing here, and to make sure all of my thread loops are the exact same size around the dress, I have counted. The top row was 30 loops and the bottom was 36 loops. In case you're wondering, there is no sure formula. You just kind of have to see how you go, see how it looks with the thickness of the thread and all that jazz. In retrospect, I probably would have used only 3 pieces of floss per loop because these are a little bit thicker than I wanted, but I'm still happy with the results, so no harm, no foul. But this was definitely an interesting hand sewing experience I haven't had. With the buttons and the button loops sewn on, it is now time to get the final little details. So from what I gathered from the pattern, it's kind of supposed to look like the front is tied and the waist is tied, and there's little bows there, and then the sleeves are each tied. I need to make the like piping or whatever, the tube that goes around the waist, to give that the like belt appearance. So that's what I'm doing here, using some bias tape I cut out from the fabric. And then I had to turn this. I could not find a good technique to do this, so I ended up doing it the safety pin method. So I actually have a lot better turning tools these days, but because of the thickness of the denim, this was quite challenging, and the safety pin trick was the only trick that worked here. On a thinner fabric, I would have had a lot more options, but this denim did not like turning. There is nowhere in the instructions that mention this, but I observed on the pattern that there's a few buttons along the neckline, so I wanted to imitate that, so I got my button placement figured out, and then I put those marks in by just using some random leftover embroidery thread in each color and tying a little piece on, so that way I would know where that button's gonna go. And then I relaxed on the couch with Spooky and sewed those in, and with that, we're ready for this reveal. I'm so excited to show you this dress. All right, you have seen the reveal. I wanted to originally do it in Cape Cod, but of course, the moment I put the dress on, I went and ate breakfast and I spilled yogurt down the front. So while I wore it the rest of the day stained, I decided I couldn't do a reveal with that much staining. So I waited till I was back here in Seattle, and I went to one of my favorite weird little wildflower patches in the city, and we did it that way, which I think worked great. But we're gonna get to cost breakdown and my final thoughts on this project. For cost breakdown, this was actually a fairly affordable project. The fabric came out at $22.47 because I picked this denim up kind of in bulk while I was in Rome, and I found a shop with pretty good pricing. And then for the notions were more expensive because the buttons. So the way I do my buttons is I just keep a running track record of all the money I spend on buttons and the number of buttons and even it out. Right now we're at like 54 cents a button. So as a result, I spent $13.50 on buttons and then $5.65 on other various notions like the zipper, the thread, etc. So that brought us to a notions total of $19.15. And then the pattern was pretty expensive. This is a pretty like specialty 1940s pattern. I would expect nothing less. And this pattern was $27.55. It is always going to be cheaper to sew with modern patterns. You can find them on sale. Often, like especially if you're going with the big five, if you're sticking to more indie brands, they do seem to stay above $15. But you can sew a lot cheaper, and I was just recently browsing Mood's free library. I do think they have a pretty decent free library there. But yeah, because I am always looking for something really special that's vintage, I do spend quite a bit more on patterns than probably the average person who sews would. So that brings us to a total of $69.17 of how much this dress costs to make. When we get down to some other comparisons, actually is not too shabby. So as for hours, I have cutting as taking an hour and a half, sewing as taking 5 hours and 30 minutes, and then hand sewing taking 7 hours and 45 minutes, which I guess now I think about it, there was quite a bit of hand sewing of buttons on, and buttons are not something I do particularly fast. So that brings us to a time spent on this project total of 14 hours and 45 minutes. Which this is definitely above average for something that I make, especially like dress-wise, and it's because of all those button details. So I guess it's like not super shocking, and I didn't want to do anything weird with my breakdown because of how much time I spent hand sewing. I want to kind of save talking about like CEO pay or other cities' living wages for when I don't have just a ton of hand sewing. So we're sticking with Seattle's living wage today at $35.39. I do still need to take a look at this adjusted for inflation because I know rents have been going up a lot. But once you multiply that 14 hours and 45 minutes by $35.39, you get $522 even. It's not because I think I'm hot stuff. It's just because I genuinely believe every single person should be paid a living wage. It's like really, really, truly, I just want us to think about the depreciated value of clothing when clothing is something that we have not really been able to automate that much. Like we do have machines that can cut fabric, but we don't really have machines that can sew fabric particularly well, and it's actually really expensive to create that technology because human hands are really nimble and hard to mimic. There's no robot sewing your clothing. It's all human hands, and those human hands are often being forced to work 75 hours a week with only 1 day a month off. And that's not acceptable. That is not an acceptable way to expect a person to live so you can like fill your closet with cheap clothing. I just like firmly don't believe price accessibility or like accessibility in general as a concept can be built on someone else's oppression. Like instead we need to be stop taking our eyes on each other, on the working class, and we need to be looking at the billionaires and the people who are profiting off the exploitation of these people. But I don't know if I ever even after all that said the total. This would be $591.17 if I was going to sell it, pay myself a living wage, and not have any profits. So that's just, I guess, putting things in somewhat of a perspective. I did do my usual research where I found an ultra fast fashion, a regular fast fashion, like our mid-level, I guess you could call it. These are your like the Limited, Anthropologies, Banana Republics, and Taylor types of sites. And then last will be your slow fashion piece that is made with reputable labor sources. So for your ultra fast fashion, I actually couldn't find anything that cheap. The cheapest one I found that was anything close to this, I also will say you can't find anything that close to it. Nobody puts weird buttons that can like lower and raise skirts. No one does that anymore, so I couldn't really find anything particularly close. So I was just looking for things with puffed sleeves and like that V bow clippy inset and then like a simple gathered skirt. So what I found, which actually fast fashion was the closest version I could find, ultra fast fashion, and it was for $43.29. So realistically, if I went and I bought this from a fast fashion brand, it likely wouldn't fit me. The other thing about fast fashion is it not only is it made with questionable labor practices, it is also made with questionable chemicals. There have been multiple times Shein, Temu, I think even H&M have been caught having things like lead in the clothing and in the toys and in the things that they are shipping. So they also are not necessarily safe for you and your family. So I would be taking that risk, and I spent $25 more to not take that risk and end up with a piece that fits me well and also is made out of 100% cotton. This piece was made out of 62% cotton, 21% polyester, 10% viscose, 6% lyocell, and 1% modal. So the reason you see all those blends in there is to get around import taxes. Import taxes are sometimes based on garment like percentages. Actually, now I think about it, Shein, the other thing Shein does that people don't talk about enough is they dodge import taxes. They do not pay the appropriate taxes they should be paying for them to sell in this country. So that's the other thing they do. I will try to link sources for all of these down below. So this isn't necessarily just about import tax, but if you were a boutique importing this, you pay a certain amount of import tax depending on things. So you use all these weird percentages to try to cheat the tax system. That was a lot of weird information. Next up, I found a piece of definitely, again, a place that uses fast fashion, although it is mid-tier and mid-priced, for $148. And as far as I could tell, this was just made with cotton. They didn't give any percentages. They just said cotton. So I assume that means 100% cotton, because in the States, you are legally required to provide what fiber content something consists of. And then slow fashion, I could not find anything cotton-based slow fashion. Slow fashion seems really into this linen thing lately. So I did find a linen dress for $265 that mimicked the silhouette and details of this dress. Actually, I ended up not that much higher than the ultra fast fashion piece for all the non-risks I then get to take to have this. I am cheaper than half of the mid-tier fast fashion price. That's just kind of interesting, and it's why I do think you get better quality for a better price, even though it is not cheap. Clothing should not be as cheap as it is. But enough of my usual ramblings about fast fashion. Here is the dress itself. One thing that I guess is nice about having spilled yogurt all over it is I have now, oh, what's in the pocket of this? An after dinner mint. What's nice about having washed this though is I can tell you this washed super great. I was actually a little worried about these little button doohickeys in the wash, and they washed really well. So I'm pretty happy there. I'm trying to think on negatives on this project. I actually think I really like how this project went. I don't feel like I can think of any initial flaws in my head of this piece. I'm overall really happy with it. I think I'm gonna go back though and tuck in the ends of this that I left unfinished. I think I would like it better if they're finished. And I guess I did wear it for a full day, and the only negative while wearing it is when you have like things like bows on your shoulders, sometimes when these little stringy guys touched my skin, I thought a bug was trying to get me. So I guess that's a negative, but otherwise I really don't have a ton of negatives to this. I wore it all day for kind of a pretty adventurous and out and about day in Cape Cod. I even climbed a lighthouse in this dress. And I will say I actually used all the skirt hikes, essentially that's what they are, of this dress to climb the lighthouse. And it was nice to be able to take a longer skirt and shorten it for climbing so many stairs. However, I will say using the buttons to shorten it is not a fast process or an easy process. I had to have my younger sister help me at the lighthouse get all of the little to be hooked right. And then because it was already on my body, I didn't feel like I could get like the folds to really lay right. So I don't know how, this is not aesthetically pleasing when functional. However, it still was functional enough nonetheless. I would definitely do the neckline differently in the future. They had you do like the seam binding instead of a facing, and in the future I'm definitely going to do a facing here. I think a facing would have just given me a cleaner look, and then it would have, I guess it gives consistency with the seam binding here and on here, but I don't know. I think it would look nicer with a facing instead of this bias bound thing. Also, again, hard to say, bias binding with denim, not great. This is a pretty light denim, I would say twill, but it is still denim. And also I definitely, when you see the reveal, this is pretty loose fitting on me, and I did that intentionally because I didn't want to wear a super tight denim dress, especially something like this that I would like to use multi-seasonally. I just didn't want it to be super tight and against my skin because I find denim to be really unpleasant to wear when it's really, really tight. So it was intentionally pretty loose. And I will also note when I wore this out and about for my day, I didn't wear a slip under it, which I will not make that mistake again. So I was wearing one of my like sweat tops and then a pair of shorts so I wouldn't have like thigh rub. And as a result, the waistband here, which it's like not the most bulky, but the waistline here as a result just kind of rubbed me all day and it was kind of annoying. So I definitely needed to wear a slip with the thickness of the waistband. But again, that's why I didn't make the dress too tight. Denim is like a working class material. It's meant to like do things. It's not supposed to be like soft and delicate and necessarily feel good. Oh, the last thing I was gonna say, I'm also kind of proud of myself for this. I've been working on my consumption, working on lowering. It's not been going the most fantastic. However, I am pretty proud of the fact that with this piece, I really wanted to buy some new fabric that like would go really well with the pastels of the buttons, and I made myself shop my own stash for this project, and I just think that like shows some growth. In the past, I would have definitely just shopped and bought some new fabric without even thinking about what's in my stash, so I'm really happy about it. I think that's all I have to say about this project. I hope you enjoyed this project. It's really fun. And honestly, you could make this type of dress tiered button situation on any pattern that is just kind of square in like the way the gathered skirt works. You just would have to choose how much tuck you have. I would say these buttons trim about 4 inches for each row. So I think you could really add this to a lot of garments. I will say when I make this pattern again, I don't like how this looks enough when it is shortened to likely do this whole button mechanical method again. However, the base pattern of the dress is so stinking cute that I will definitely be using this pattern again. And that is the end of this video. If you stuck around this long, definitely subscribe. I put out a sewing video every other Friday, and in between it I have fun things like travel vlogs, thrifting hauls, fabric hauls, what I'm making off camera, things like that. And of course, if you have been around a while and feel the desire to support this channel at all financially, I do have both a Patreon and a Ko-fi. This just helps me try to get to break even on this channel. Last year, I was spending negative 82 cents an hour working on this channel. This year, my goal is to just hit 0. I would love to not be losing money on this channel. So I always appreciate any financial gifts or help people want to send my way. And of course, you can always support for free by commenting down below, giving it a thumbs up, and sharing it with your friends or anyone you know who would enjoy this type of content. And I will see you next week at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Bye!